We are super excited that you're here. I will start with the slides. So I'm going to try and show my slides again here. I'm not a big slide guy, but we'll do it for now. And of course, now it's going to I have to click on the share button, right? Can you guys see it yet? Oh, you can't see it. Okay, perfect. All right. So one of the things, if we had an opening question for this in Torrey, it would be something along the lines of wanting to know, why is this Tocqueville guy, why is he fought over by liberals, conservatives, libertarians, socialists? They all want to say Tocqueville was on our side. That in itself should want to make you think about, and to put it in context of some of your other authors, nobody wants Machiavelli or Hobbes on their side, right? Nobody wants that, but everybody wants Tocqueville to be a part of their side. And part of that is because the truths that he reveals about that seem so spot on, and the solutions he gives seems like there is some room to work within those solutions. So he's one of the reasons why I think he is really a way to unlock understanding your democracy better and getting past this sort of massive partisan divide and recognizing that Tocqueville is looking at this from a much higher perspective. In fact, he says, Tocqueville says, I am looking at this as the person who's like, you can't just look at the adult and say, let me figure out what this person's all about. He's like, you have to go back until they were a baby and understand them. Where did they come from? What was going on around the time of their birth? We have to dig into the beginnings. And he says, the great thing about America is that we have a beginning. He says, all of these other countries, we can't go back to 374 and try and find the right people, the right Romans wandering around England to say, what is the beginning of England? Those are very difficult because there's just not as much documented on it. But we have this special thing where America is this very helpful case study where we actually know quite a bit about the founding, which should also remind you that Tocqueville doesn't think the founding of America is simply well, we have to go back to the Magna Carta or something like that. He's like, no, we can have this very distinctive founding that for him starts in two places, in New England with the Puritans and in Virginia with sort of the Federalist movement and things like that. These are the two main core pieces that Tocqueville sees that is what America is really about. And we don't have to go back a whole lot farther than that. We can probably go back 1760s and be good enough to figure out most of this. Well, I'd say maybe a little earlier than that to think about the New England townships and sort of maybe late 1500s, 1600s, as we're thinking about the development of those townships. But even that, he's saying that's still not really America yet. That just tells us what sort of those seeds are. That's almost like the unborn is in those New England townships. And then eventually we'll see when the baby is born, that's kind of the 1776-ish point, and then he moves on from there. So one important thing to start with, and I know this will seem redundant, but Tocqueville is a guy, okay? So one of the things that you begin with is he's not an old crusty philosopher sitting around writing his things. He tricks his benefactors and be like, I'm going to go write a book about the prison system because the French prison system is pretty crummy. I'm going to go write a book about it. I'm going to take my friend Beaumont with me. And they're like, great, sounds good. Here's some grant money, right? He's like, and then secretly, I'm going to write the greatest book ever written on sort of the development of American democracy. But guess what? He still did his homework. I always remind students, he did his homework. He actually did write the prison report and turn that in. But then he had this wonderful 2 volumes of Democracy in America that he added. And I'll add one note at the beginning. It is not enough even for Tocqueville. He would tell you, I'm making him stare at you right now so you can hear Tocqueville saying, it is not enough to have read Democracy in America to understand democracy in America. You need to dig into the stories behind it. And he says, my great buddy Beaumont wrote this book called Marie, or American Slavery. And he said he will get to the next level of the one thing that Tocqueville says, I don't even have enough time really to get into is the slavery question. He's like, but you can fix that by reading Beaumont's book, which will just, it's from Johns Hopkins Press. There's not a ton of copies around. Get it. It's one of the most incredible novels. If you did not have the date on it, you would think that it was written last year. And I am not kidding. You would think that it is sort of a modern retelling of a 12 years, 7 years, 12 years a slave, something like that. And then when you realize that this is literally him writing it along the way as him and Tocqueville are traveling across America, it becomes pretty powerful. So even Tocqueville reminds us this is not all the way to understand it. Okay. All right. So I want to start off with something that is, again, I recognize that this will sound like some of our politicians who are like, AI is 2 letters and it's got an A and an I in it, and those stand for artificial intelligence. And that's what I know what I'm about to tell you will sound like that. So please bear with me for a few minutes while we get to the heart of this. This is what some people think. So I'm going to tell you that it is about 3 things. It is about democracy. meaning that independently, it is a story about democracy. It is also about America, which means he says it's not a travel log. He tells us this in his notes. I'm not writing like just a travel literature, which, by the way, was crazy popular in the mid-1800s. Everybody wanted to be like, tell me about the bears you shot, Tocqueville, and did you ride a buffalo? And he's like, no, you don't ride buffalo, right? And they're not even buffalo, they're American bison, right? You're missing the whole point. And there's a little bit of these sort of discussions of like the country and the land, but for the most part, you're not going to get that out of Tocqueville. It's about something different about America, which is about American culture. And so some will call him the first social scientist because he's, and I like to prefer what he calls himself. It's just something like a thinker about social states, which is not exactly a modern day social scientist. Okay, so it is about America. And then people think, oh, and what he's doing then, the exciting thing he does. Actually, I'm curious. Can you see when I do that? You can't see my, oh, you can see my arrow? Oh, how nice. It doesn't show up for me. Okay, so here you go. So it is about democracy. It is about America. And people are like, oh, so democracy in America is just the things that are America that are overlapping with democracy. And that's the thing that is democracy in America, right? That's the answer. No, that is like the exact opposite. That is the worst possible way to think about what the project is, because he's saying there are things that are purely democratic and could happen anywhere. And then he will say, and there are things that are happening in America that aren't necessarily connected to the democratic revolution, but they do tie into it. But then he says there's this weird third thing in which they're interacting in weird ways. Think of a chemist who's like having these completely unexpected reactions. Like, I think that the Venn diagrams are just like, oh, of course, we just look at what's both and we put them together. But Tocqueville is not looking at that. He's looking at it as a chemist, as a deep thinker on what is actually these interactions all over the place. It's not one big interaction. It's several interactions all over the place occurring at the same time. It's the way that the military is tying into the system of federalism. It's the way that the literature and the theater are countered against these crazy, massive partisan newspapers. And he's trying to make sense of a lot of these things. And he says, so what you get then is something like Democracy in America, which I would say is a sort of solution for the problems of democracy. So in another way, this is actually a book about democracy in France, but he's like, but we don't really know what's going to happen with that yet. So let's, again, look at the model that we have, this new baby, where he says the democratic wave first crashed on America in this powerful way. And it's like looming like a tsunami in the ocean. It's coming to France, but it's not here yet. What can we do about that before it gets it? And what can we learn from the Americans? And my favorite part is to be like, oh, it's a prescription for how to handle democracy. No, because he will tell the poor French people, like, these things are super crazy, weird American things that France could never do. We will never be able to build up the civic associations the way that they do in America. It's just not in our blood. We would think it is crazy talk because he says you have too many thousands of years of aristocracy fighting against that. And America doesn't have that, okay? So don't think about it this way. So then you're like, okay, now Dr. Van Hook, we've been waiting for it. Let's get his diagram. There is no drawing, okay? There is no diagram because Tocqueville himself says there are things that are happening that we don't have names for yet. One of them you'll hear is, well, let's call it soft despotism. But even Tocqueville says, I don't even like that name really. Democratic despotism, soft despotism. He's like, it's the kind of despotism, he says at the end of the book, that would be like if a parent was raising a child, but instead of helping that child raise up and grow up and get on their own, their goal was to make that child a perpetual child and never leave the household. And life would be good. Your mom would be making you peanut butter sandwiches when you're 30 and doing your laundry. There would be nice things about this. But he's like, but you wouldn't be fully developed and you would be living under a form of despotism you might even not even know you're living under, right? So that is sort of his concerns. And he says that's why we need to figure these things out. There is no easy way to understand this. You just have to read my whole book, is basically what he says. And then he says that's why he says this quote about we need a new political scientist for a world entirely new. And by the way, I'm going to take a short break to say, if you are like, what is the book that Dr. Van Hook would recommend? If I want to buy a Tocqueville copy, I would recommend the Harvey Mansfield translation. It's a single volume. It's got decent footnotes. It's not overly large, okay? And it will get you basically what you need. That's what I'll be reading from today. Now, if you got my handouts earlier, you notice that I also sent you to the Liberty Fund online Library of Liberty. That's because that is even free. So that is also a great resource. The tricky part of that for a new reader, and why I don't recommend it for a new reader, is because it has almost all of his notes and letters to his dad and all those things kind of crushed in. Sometimes it's hard to, with the brackets and everything, to figure out exactly what he wanted the final version to look like. So I highly recommend the Harvey Mansfield Chicago Press version for a one volume. And then later, if you want to study, you can do it. Or I've literally built the foundation of this lecture on the Torrey books. If you notice, my screen got lower because I have all 4 volumes of the Liberty Fund version that has both the English and the French. But right now it's being used to raise up my computer a little bit so my head doesn't look so weird. So there you go. We'll get into that if we need it. Okay, so there is no drawing. We have to get into the text to figure it out. So let's hit a few key parts of the text, and then we're going to take a break for a second and bring Sierra and our panelists in. So first of all, what is going on with this democracy, and why is he so interested? Like, why is it this giant wave? Well, he says in the introduction, this is how big it is. To wish to stop democracy would then appear to be a struggle against God himself, and it would remain only for nations to accommodate themselves to the social state that providence imposes on them. Important point. He doesn't say that God is actually throwing democracy on the Americans. He says it is almost as though you're going against the hand of providence, right? It is that big of an effort. So the jury might be out on whether or not Tocqueville thinks God is like throwing democracy on us. But what he does say is it's that level of powerful movement that the world has never seen. And of course, in the modern times, I know we keep like, oh yeah, everyone knows French Revolution was important. And Tocqueville's like, no, the French Revolution is everything. You're upending 2,000 years with this new thing that now says that system that we used to have, that we believe was all ordained by God and our sort of divine right of kings and things like that, that's getting thrown out. And now it seems almost like God's throwing this new democracy on us. Okay. And as a teacher at Biola, where we study a lot of theology in the Bible, I could talk a lot about how the history of Christianity is partly making major strides towards more democratic equality, okay? So what then we do with this? Well, he says this is the job, to instruct democracy, if possible, to reanimate its beliefs, to purify its mores, to regulate its movements, to substitute little by little the science of affairs for its inexperience, and knowledge of its true interests for its blind instincts, to adapt its government. Oh, I did make a typo. Sorry, but to adapt its government to time and place, to modify it according to circumstances and men. Such is the first duty imposed on those who direct society in our day. This is the key takeaway of why this book is so important and why everyone's fighting. Back to the conservatives, the liberals, they all want to know, like, we want Tocqueville on our side because Tocqueville said, your only job, statesmen, is to figure out how to tame all of the negative and dangerous aspects of democracy. There is literally nothing else to conquer. You've conquered the world, you've conquered nature. And again, we're talking 1800s. And he's like, yeah, we're already conquering nature and we're not even close to the Industrial Revolution. But relatively, he's like, we're conquering all these other things. But there's this new thing that's way more challenging, and that's to keep this democratic monster kind of intact. And that's the job of all statesmen. So if that's the job of all statesmen, Tocqueville said, if you are messing it up and in fact empowering the things that make democracy dangerous and reducing the things that make it powerful, Tocqueville's like, that's your fault. You are now contributing to all of the bad versions of democracy. Now, the radical thing about this, which we won't talk a ton of tonight, is that for Tocqueville, the most dangerous thing is what he calls sort of the distorted version of equality. He says there's a wonderful, amazing version of equality that wants to lift everybody else. All those nobles that were like, we're tired of the serfs being there. We have brilliant serfs who are artists and thinkers, and I've hung out with them. And this is ridiculous that, that they're living down there farming the dirt when they could be creating, works of political philosophy. So there's this great part of equality that wants to yank those people up. But then there's this horrible part of equality where the people at the bottom are like, ooh, we started moving up a little bit. You know what? It will take us too long to get up here, even with these nobles. Let's yank them down. That will make it easier to get to equality. And that's one of the major things that Tocqueville fears. So I'm going to have one more slide, and then we're going to go to our panelists here. But so, okay, what are the kinds of things? And so it's a big book, right? So you're like, well, hopefully he had at least a few things that he thinks would count for instructing democracy. I mean, if it ended at the introduction, he's like, well, figure it out, everyone, like, good luck, right? That would have been probably the postscript to the prison project, right? He could have said something like, and if you get this right, maybe you won't have so many terrible prisoners, right? But he says, no. I have thought a lot about this. Let me get you started, right? And what he ends up with, at least for what is at work at democracy, and again, as we work through these, if you were working through the text, as we encourage you to do in CLT, what I would want you to do is, as you hit those different themes, which is a great book because Tocqueville loves you guys. He makes you nice, lots of little chapters with great titles and easy ways to find things. So it's not that hard to find where he talks about these things. And what you would go through and say, okay, religion, the Christian religion, is that democracy? Is that America? Or is that the sort of democracy and American blend? I think I'll give that one as an example. You'll find that it's a bit of a blend. He gets very excited about his own Catholicism again. He's like, I haven't even known if I believed in God for a while. And I came to America and got all excited about my Catholic faith again. That's kind of weird, right? And he's like, it's not like the Americans invented Catholicism, but there's something about the American devotion to religion generally that had this weird sort of chemical reaction with Catholicism that makes Catholicism a different kind. On a side note, my dissertation's on Hamilton, and even Hamilton, in one of his what is considered a very anti-Catholic document, but if you read it deeply, he says, look, the king, he hates you Catholics, and what he really wants is to make you his slaves forever and make you a papish people, right? And so everyone's like, oh, he was so anti-Catholic because he's calling them a papish people. But then if you look at what he says, he's like, but Canadians, you could be the right kind of Catholic church in which you would understand the way in which you interact with the Pope as the signs of God and not connected to the politics. You could be free of the bad things England wants to do to weigh you down, right? So Hamilton talks about this. Tocqueville loves Hamilton, as we'll see in a second. But yeah, so that's one thing. Now, I'm just going to kind of throw those out. We won't have time to talk about them, but this is where I want to throw it to our panelists to say, anyone that's read that would have seen these themes show up. And again, it's an open book exam. So even if you don't have your book, you can like go on Online Liberty right now, and you can Control F, find these topics if you want. But I'd like to throw it for a few minutes to our panelists to talk about, as you work your way through this book, what were some of the defenses that you thought were the best kinds of defenses, or maybe even just the most interesting ones as you work your way through Tocqueville? And this is for any of you, yes.
Yeah.
Sarah,
well, I can start and then we can throw it to our student panelists as well. One thing that I was really interested by was Tocqueville's use of religion and how he talks about religion and individualism and leading to that egotism and despotism that you mentioned that we won't be talking about much here. But one of, I guess, the question that Dr. Van Hook can touch on later is, you mentioned how we're trying to tame democracy, like some of these are the defenses against those. Is that through the American culture that you mentioned earlier, speaking directly to its citizens, or is it through some of the power of governance, specifically in policy? And what directly then is Tocqueville's really audience? Is he talking to the government or is he talking to the citizens?
is that a question, or is that something for everyone to think about? Or were you
It's just something, yeah, it's something for everyone to think about. It can also be a question for you, Dr. Van Hook, but it's one of the main questions that I took away after reading Tocqueville, especially when it came down to religion, as it is something that's not necessarily in the government's hands, but it is something that is affecting citizens.
Yeah, and we can remember there's kind of like a test where like, well, there's the easy answer, which federalism is definitely the structure of the government. That is very heavily coming down from people who put this government in place. It's coming from Publius, and then it's expected that the government, and remember, gets tricky. When Hamilton says the government, he means the executive branch, which is something that Tocqueville is very interested in, because he's like, I cannot believe those people that just come out of a monarchy gave the executive that much power. That's something interesting for us to think about. So federalism would be one of those ones that are an easy answer. Juries get a little trickier because that's kind of like the demand of the people. Like there was like, no, we're having juries of our peers. That's not even an option. And then you can think about the townships. Well, there's a cultural part of those townships, but then there's also an organization. Like, here's the way that we're going to put together our city council, and here's where our state and church lines of demarcation are in our township, right? Again, you want to know about townships, a great show, believe it or not, for this is go watch Gilmore Girls on Stars Hollow, and you will see actually a lot of what Tocqueville's talking about. Every time they have a town meeting there, it is like Tocqueville's like clapping in his grave for like, yep, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And he's like, this is the 2000s or late 90s or whatever that came out. And he's like, and this is still, the townships still have these weird elements to it that we're laughing about as watching the show. But Tocqueville's like, no, there's really, really important things going on in those town hall meetings in the Gilmore Girls. And also shouldn't be a surprise because Tocqueville thinks women are actually one of the other major defenses against all the ills of democracy. So it shouldn't surprise you that he would love Gilmore Girls on like multi-level meta, as we would say. So.
That's actually an interesting point that you're bringing up with the Gilmore Girls, with the self-interest part, as referenced on the slide, is every single player in those meetings has their own self-interest. I mean, Taylor wants to make the town this perfect idyllic place. Kirk just wants to hang in a box above a street, whatever. But it's actually the acknowledgement of that is actually a pretty good defense, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great point. And then to add to Annalise's point, for Tocqueville, remember that self-interest well understood. It can't just be like, I just want this and that's great. It's like, well, I want this. If I just take it right now, I won't actually get the end goal that I want. And that's like what Annalise was saying about those town meetings. If they all just try to make huge bids for power immediately, it wouldn't work out for them. And so they're smart enough to know, like, I kind of got to bide my time to figure out how I'm going to get the end result that I want. And that might mean other people get what they want as well, right? I mean, and that's kind of the goal. Well, at least that's the goal of democracy for Tocqueville. It might not be, as Annalise said, it might not be the individual goals of those people who are like, I just need what I need here, and to come out of this meeting farther ahead than I started before, or as Tocqueville reminds us, or I got to pull somebody else down at that meeting closer to my level, right? You can look at the things that are the most interesting. I find that I have loved teaching the chapters on women to some of the most brilliant and strong women in the United States at the Air Force Academy. I mean, these are women who are being fighter pilots. One of them is actually coming back. She got her MPhil at Oxford and will be coming back to speak for our Constitution Day here. Just incredibly amazing women that actually Tocqueville says, it is the bizarre thing about it. He's like, these women could literally do anything. They're some of the most amazing people who've ever lived. They can go out and plow a field, come back and educate their children in their own homes. And they can also run a town meeting. And yet they choose oftentimes to be like, yeah, we'll do all the work without the glory. Now we could argue see, Tocqueville, you're bad. You're sticking them in that thing. But I read it as to partly Tocqueville's like, and when they finally figure out how to do both, America should be even better, right? But then he would have been horrified by if he's like, and by the women doing these other things, they gave up all the other things, right? So Tocqueville would be big on the family to say, if the women sort of abandon the children completely, right? And again, I don't want to do anything that sounds like it's stepping on toes, but I think Tocqueville would have some serious concerns about sort of everything from the American sort of full-time daycare. When I say full-time, I mean you don't see the kid other than when you put them to bed at night. And that's actually quite on the socialist side, which if you go to an Israeli kibbutz where they used to raise the children completely separate from everyone else, and Tocqueville would say that is going to be a problem for you later because they're actually missing out on the chance to develop meaningful relationships with moms that are extremely important for protecting against those waves of democracy. So, okay, anything else from our panelists before we can move on? We'll have some more time for questions for you guys, but Mary Grace, do you have anything?
I thought it was really interesting. I was reading that introduction that was sent, and I thought it was really interesting how Tocqueville is explaining how democracy has always been connected with good, even in ancient Greek times, who of course didn't know of God, but how over the centuries democracy has been connected to, as it says, the sacred character of the will of God. But then I also thought about how the whole divine right of kings thing that you were mentioning, and how both of those seem to be connected to the will of God, and that kind of elucidates some of the causes of both the American and the French revolutions, how people were thinking how both democracy and the divine right of kings are connected to the will of God, and one of them has to win. That was kind of an interesting point for me to think about.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Mary Grace. That actually is quite profound. What Mary Grace is hinting at is so we start out with other authors that you're going to read for the CLT. I guarantee at some point you're going to read Plato and Aristotle, right? That's probably one I should read before I take the CLT. Yes, I agree. And Plato is going to start with we all know democracy is horrible, right, Plato? And it's horrible because we're living in Athens and it's gone awry a bunch of times. And Plato's, and actually Plato doesn't say anything, as is big for me and Torrey. Plato says nothing, but Plato's Socrates and other philosophers in his dialogues do say things. And Plato's Socrates says, democracy is bad in some ways, but in other ways, it tends to do some pretty interesting regulating of bad societies. So it's definitely not, when he ranks his societies, it's not at the top, right? Socrates was well, that would be crazy to put democracy at the top. But he starts thinking it may be way better though than everyone thinks it is. Aristotle comes along and does the same thing and says, well, there are certain important things about democracy that we might not want to lose. So when we look at his sort of ideal regime, it does have a mix of democracy in it. In fact, the weirdest thing about it is it ends up being something like, he calls it the polity, like the regime that doesn't have any name. And it is this sort of weird blending of a perfect polity where everyone would do the right thing all the time if they knew God's will. So, something to the effect of Hamilton, who says at one point, well, yeah, the ideal government would be everyone having complete access to the natural law, like Aquinas says, and doing the right thing all the time. That's probably not going to happen. But yes, if we could do that, then a democracy would work okay. Since we can't, we have to do other things with that democracy. Hamilton is not Aristotelian in the sense he doesn't just blend like, okay, let's take a little bit of oligarchy and a little bit of democracy and like a little element of kingship, and we'll throw them together and boom, that's the ideal government. That's not actually the case for Hamilton at all. That he's like, we're going to do something totally new in this republic. And that is why Tocqueville loves Hamilton, because he's like, I'm throwing all that trash out, because that would be a political science very old for a world entirely new. And as we know, Tocqueville says that's the exact opposite. We need an entirely new political science for the world entirely new. So as much as Tocqueville you could read into the Township some virtue and things like this. Oh, Tocqueville's really Aristotelian, which is my other point to you guys. As much as the political factions fight over him, the scholarly community loves fighting over him. He's a political philosopher. No, he's a social scientist. Oh, what he really wants to do is get people back into their communities like Aristotle did. No, he wants to explode them all like Locke did. No, he wants to bring reason in for Aquinas. And the answer is, he's got all these things going on in the book, and he's not quite clear exactly how those work, because he's like, that's the hard work of figuring out which of those pieces work to make things better and which didn't. So, well, let's move on just to a few more slides, because I really want to take your questions. I love talking about Tocqueville, and it's way more interesting to me to hear what your questions are about it than to just keep droning on. But the other thing I wanted to add to this then, and we'll read just a couple quotes I'm going to read to you. There are other things that aren't exactly barriers. He does not say like the theater is a barrier. He says the theater in America is super weird, right? And so I want to talk about that a little bit. And I actually have had one of my students at the Air Force Academy. When you're like, why should I read these great books? The Academy Scholars Program, or it's been renamed now the Martinson Honors Program under a big donation that they got. I got the real blessing of running the social sciences division part of that for a very long time, and taught several Rhodes Scholars and Marshall Scholars and Schwarzman Scholars. And one of my Rhodes Scholars, she wrote her entire final paper on this one tiny chapter about the theater and how that would relate to American cinema, right? Which I'm looking at Sarah, she's like, that sounds like a good film student project at Biola. I'm like, it would be a fantastic one. So it's the richness that you can get there. And people are like, by the way, her major was math, and she works on AI way before it was cool to be doing AI, right? This is several years ago when she and the other Rhodes Scholar, 2 Rhodes Scholars in 1 year, they were both part of that honors college, and they were both my students. And they were both massively in talking about how awesome Tocqueville was. So I just want you to know, like, Rhodes Scholars think that Tocqueville is important. So, but yeah, so the other guy that won it, he does AI from the computer science side, she does the math side, but both of them are putting these two things together. Like, you know what though? Understanding American film and theater somehow ties in to figuring out how to not let Skynet be developed, right? I told them, like, that's my main charge to you. They're like, how could we, like, you know, make you proud as a teacher? I'm like, just don't launch Skynet, you know, and turn the robots against us. Read some Tocqueville to help you. Okay, so there's these other things. I just want to throw them out to you. There's other things that are not barriers, but they might tie into them. So for example, he says military officers, they're not place hunting. It's a very different kind of work in there. I think he would really like the Air Force. And that's not just because I did 26 years as an Air Force pilot, but because he really did think that there was something about George Washington that kind of changed the whole deal there, but not enough to be like a full barrier, because that's just one person. And you can't count on 1 or 2 great people fixing all your problems for you, okay? Forms. He says, Americans hate forms. They hate laws, yet they don't realize those are the very things protecting their liberties, right? They want to get rid of the forms, but if they get rid of all the forms, they've lost some of those blockages. In fact, I would say forms probably could go on the defenses page too. But it's also this very important thing of, like, Tocqueville's like, how do these forms develop, right? Like, how do these kinds of things, the weird cultural norms of America, how did those come about, right? So I just want to take 1 second here before we kind of move towards the end to talk about why, again, back to sort of how this tells us about American democracy. And again, when I'm saying American democracy to you right now, I'm not talking about when the Washington Post says our democracy, right? The Washington Post needs to, like, take a 1 month leave of absence and read Tocqueville together. So they will stop talking about our democracy in this utterly uninformed, silly way, right? And they'll be like, oh, our democracy is quite complex. And when we just try to simplify it in this way, we're missing important points. And that's what leads to these harsh battles that end up people yelling and screaming and not really getting a lot to the heart of the problem. Well, one of the things that I love about Tocqueville is he has some people that really inspire him. One of them, who is my favorite person, who is another reason I wanted Miss Christensen to come here tonight, because she's read some Montesquieu, and Tocqueville loves Montesquieu. Okay, he read a lot of it. That he says Tocqueville, Pascal, and Rousseau. I spent a lot of time with these 3 guys. But then later he mentions, but there's these other 3 guys named Publius that I also am very interested in. So in Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 8, what he says is, talking about the way that the federal government set up, he says, as it was foreseen that in practice, questions could arise relative to the exact limits of this exceptional government. And he does mean exceptional. He's like, it's a very strange republic. He says, and that it would be dangerous to abandon the solution of these questions to ordinary tribunals instituted in the different states by the states themselves. In other words, we can't let the fights between New York and New Jersey just go to like, well, let's see what New York and New Jersey think about it. Like, they will probably each think that they're right. Not a surprise, right? So he says, instead, they created a high federal court, a unique tribunal, one attribute of which was to maintain the division of power between the 2 rival governments as the Constitution had established it. So the court is there to adjudicate between these 2 giant powers. And that's when Tocqueville realizes, and sorry, Hamilton, I'm not quite believing you that, the executive is as weak as you're trying to tell us. It's pretty powerful. It's not as powerful as Congress, but it's pretty powerful. And he said they devised a court that could settle disputes between the states. And that is massively important to him. Then what he says about it in a footnote, so this is why I love this, and these are Tocqueville's footnotes, not Harvey Mansfield's, where he says, and I love this line, and this is the footnote right around where he is talking about that, where he talks about Fed 45, and he says, I shall often have occasion to cite the Federalist in this work. By the way, is this another CLT book, right, Natalie? I'm right on that, right? Federalist Papers? Yeah, okay. What the project of law that has since become the Constitution of the United States was before the people submitted it for their adoption, 3 men already celebrated and who have since become even more so, John Jay, Hamilton, and Madison. By the way, when we think like, when did they finally know who Publius was? Well, we at least know by 1830, because Tocqueville knows who they are, right? So there's some question like, when do they know for sure? Well, Tocqueville thinks they know for sure by then, okay? And he says, they got together, they associated for the purpose of making stand out in the eyes of the nation the advantages of the project that had been submitted to it. Now, they couldn't do that by standing up on a soapbox and hoping that everybody just like, well, hopefully everyone sent a delegate to Washington to hear about this. No. Or New York, sorry. He said, no. With this design, they published in newspaper form a series of articles, the sum of which forms a complete treatise. So in other words, it is a bunch of articles, but it is one work. This is important. If you're ever like, oh, Federalist Papers are not really one work, we shouldn't put it in a big book like this. Well, Publius thought it was and did it because Hamilton put it in a book. And then Tocqueville thinks, of course, it's one book that you have to do. But notice again, coming back in is those newspapers we talked about, right? This American project is not going to make it without this weird American thing. Like everybody wants to have their own newspaper. And he's like, that is not a British thing. They do not all want to have their own newspapers. The French like to stuff stuff out, but they would much rather have a bunch of little political parties, sort of assassinating one another than actually, have newspapers do the work for them. So he says, okay, they had given to their newspaper series the name Federalist, which was kept for the work. The Federalist is a fine book that, though special to America, ought to be familiar to statesmen of every country. And the reason for that is like, you cannot read the Federalist Papers and go to Germany and be like, let's just throw this government together. He's like, no, this is that whole democracy in America. This government is working very well with America. And there's certain things about it that are just too American to transport to someone else's shores. Okay. Now, and then this is my favorite line. And then a few short pages later on 144, where he's talking about Publius once more. He says, this is, and again, I am a Hamilton scholar, you guys. And again, yes, I finished my dissertation in 2015. I've been writing it since 2012. I liked Hamilton before it was cool, but no one will ever remember that now. But if you go look at the publication date of my dissertation, you'll see like, oh yeah, Van Hook really did like Hamilton before it was cool to like Hamilton. Because remember, this is what I want to transition to. Up until this time, people like, Hamilton's the devil, right? Like the Jeffersonians control the nation's narrative. And they're like, It is a good thing Hamilton died when he did, or we would have all been dead meat. And this, by the time Tocqueville's talking, this is actually one of the weirdest, most radical things he writes, is what I'm about to read you. He says, the sovereignty of the people and the freedom. Oh, wait, hang on. Oh, it flipped on me. Sorry. There we go. Got to go back there. I was like, that's not the right one. He said, well, I'm going to read a little bit farther back. He said, they're all reared, all of these guys, right? They're all reared in the midst of a social crisis, all these framers, during which the spirit of freedom had to struggle continuously against a strong and dominant authority. After the struggle ended, and while the excited passions of the crowd were, according to its habit, still engaged in combating dangers that had long since ceased to exist. In other words, they're still fighting whiskey rebellions and weird things like that. He says, they stopped. They cast a more tranquil and more penetrating regard on their native country. In other words, they're like, let's stop all of the killing, right? Like, let's not, sorry, Jefferson, we don't need to reflush the tree of liberty with the blood of patriots. He said some of these guys, and this is how you know he's not talking about Jefferson anymore. Now he's down to Washington and John Marshall and John Jay and Hamilton, okay? They saw that a definitive revolution had been accomplished. It's already done. And that from then on, the dangers that threaten the people could only arise from the abuses of freedom. And then now, like, Sarah Christensen's like, yes, please. Right now, I want to tell you why this is exactly like what Lincoln says in the Perpetuation Address, which you also read some Lincoln in CLT. This is pulled right from all the way from Washington and Hamilton up through Tocqueville to Lincoln, who says, yeah, these right people started to figure out the only way this country is going to fall is actually from within and through abusing our own liberty. And this is the line, what they thought they had the courage to say, because they felt at the bottom of their hearts a sincere and ardent love for that same freedom, that they dared to speak of restricting it, because they were sure that they did not wish to destroy it. And like, I'm getting chills because I'm like, this is very Montesquieuian, by the way, but he's like, because nobody wanted to hear them talk about why we would need a strong executive and why the Congress should be able to, like, you know, basically nullify state laws that conflict with the Constitution. Tocqueville is saying they knew that they had to say it when it was the least popular. And that's why Washington is such a great in the Washington-Lincoln battle, which again, we don't have Lincoln yet. By the way, weirdly enough, right? Lincoln is kicking around in his young political career when Tocqueville's writing this. So don't forget this. He's literally delivering the Perpetuation Address we just talked about at the same time that Tocqueville is writing this book. And I'll blow your mind even more. If you've seen the Hamilton the musical, right? Don't forget, Liza lives a long time. In fact, Liza, Tocqueville, and Hamilton could conceivably have all crossed paths in Washington, D.C. at one point. So, like, let that sit with you for a second. Again, so they made this decision because they felt at the bottom of their hearts that the only way we're going to protect this liberty is by restricting it a bit. And if we don't restrict it, it'll get destroyed. And so he's like, that's the project. And then my favorite is he then quotes, in this period, the celebrated Alexander Hamilton, one of the most influential authors of the Constitution, did not fear to publish what follows. And then he reads, and then he lists, this is like one of his biggest footnotes. I can't know if you can see it, but he lists this enormous chunk of Federalist 71. The biggest thing that he cites from all the Federalist Papers is on Hamilton, the executive, reminding them, like, this is the kind of thing that everyone else is like, that's crazy. A strong executive is the worst possible thing for our democracy, right? And Tocqueville's like, no, they knew that that wasn't true. And it needed some checks and balances, and it had to be separated from the other powers, and it needed a Supreme Court to help do things. But they recognize this is going to be completely unpopular, just like John Jay coming back from Britain with the Jay Treaty, and everybody hates it, but secretly they're like, well, he might have gotten a little bit more, but you're like, what army did he have backing him up? So, like, he didn't even get the British out of the Northwest Ordnance, the Northwest posts. And Jay's like, right, how many soldiers do we have? Like 5 guys on a mule up there? Like, of course we're not going to get those posts back from Britain. We have nothing to back it up. And even when they had nothing, they're making these pretty strong stances to make America better. Okay, we're going to end on a couple quotes. Back to the introduction to kind of close up, and then we're going to open up for some Q&A, starting with Sierra and our panelists, and then open to the crowd, and Sierra will be working on that. Okay, here's the reason why he writes this. He says, look, there's one country in the world where the great social revolution I'm speaking of seems nearly have to obtain its natural limits, right? In other words, the tsunami has crashed. It wiped out the first, houses on the shore. It's flooded the middle of the land. It's kind of subsiding now. There it has operated in a simple and easy manner, or one can say that this country sees the results of the democratic revolution operating among us without having the revolution itself. Now, this is the sad part. For if you're like a America kind of guy, and you're like, I love Tocqueville. Tocqueville's America kind of guy. This is actually the problem. He's not going to say something you like, which is, no, Americans, I'm sorry, you did not have a real revolution, because it was too easy. And that's because there was all these friendly things that were going on in America that made democracy hit our shores a little less hard than they hit the French shores. And again, you got to remember that, like, oh, Tocqueville, he just doesn't understand how awesome our revolution is. And Tocqueville's like, you don't understand how all my family members were like getting their heads chopped off during the French Revolution. And you didn't have a whole lot of that going on. Yeah, you shoot some traitors every once in a while, and you have a little bit of that, but you're not like dragging everybody out in the streets, publicly executing them. You don't have to kill a king, right? He's like, you had it a bit easy, but he's like, America, don't be like sad about that, right? This is the person who's, if you've ever heard them like testify, like, you know, where like, I used to be this horrible drunk, and then I came and became not an alcoholic anymore. As Lincoln will talk about this in the temperance address. You have the people like, well, I was a drunk that beat my wife and kids, and I was horrible, and then I saw the light and became redeemed, right? And you're like, that's a powerful story. But Lincoln and Tocqueville and everyone else is like, but don't also remember the story, like, you know, my daddy drank a lot, and I realized alcohol wasn't good, so I took the pledge. And I didn't drink since I was 15, and I never beat my wife. And Tocqueville's like, that's not a bad thing, America. It is not a bad thing. You didn't have to like chop people's heads off, right? Okay. And then last, on like classic literature, this is why Rip Van Winkle is not this little kid story in a picture book. It is this powerful image of like, he goes to sleep when King George is on the throne. He comes back like, wait a minute, I thought we liked this king. Now everybody hates him, and there's this Washington guy up, right? And how fast that goes, extremely Tocquevillian. In fact, Irving and James Fenimore Cooper, who writes Last of the Mohicans, those are the kind of books that Tocqueville's reading when he comes to America. He's like, those are the kind of things to read to understand America. But also read my buddy's Beaumont's book on Maria and slavery. Read that too, but also go read just some James Fenimore Cooper and read yourself a little bit of Washington Irving. Okay, so let's end on this. Why do it? Because he says, I confess, I will tell you all now the truth. And he tells you the truth at the end of the introduction. It is not a surprise for the next, if you got the Mansfield transition, the next 699-ish pages, right? He says, I confess that in America, I saw more than America. I sought there an image of democracy itself, of its penchants, its characters, its prejudices, its passions. I wanted to become acquainted with it, if only to know at least what we ought to hope or fear from it. In other words, he's saying, again, I knew that some of these things were democracy in America, and I couldn't bring them up, but if I could just get good at sort of pulling apart some of those American things, figure out these chemical reactions, maybe I could understand a little more about the democratic things and figure out how France to do it. And if you read the whole work, you'll see there's things that he's like, France probably could do something a little bit better with their political associations. They're never going to be weird Americans and like, let's all get together and build a library ourselves. He's like, that's an American thing. There's still too many rich people in France that'll be like, no, I am the rich person. I shall build the library and put my name on it, right? But there are things like religion. He thinks religion may actually be a place where if we can destroy sort of the French Revolution, the French Revolution chopped the head off of Christianity and replaced it with this like, pagan god of liberty. And he's like, if we could sort of get back at the fact that Christianity was not all bad. In fact, it was quite good for some of the keeping people from getting their heads rolling in America. Like we could do some of that in France maybe, but it will take work, right? Okay. So that's kind of where I wanted to end up. I hope that helps you think a little bit of why so many people are fighting over it. I mean, literally socialists are like, oh, he's a socialist. And other people are like, no, he's a free market libertarian. Any book where you have that going on is the book to read. And I will say it's the same about a really wonderful movie about terrorism. My master's degree is in security studies, and I spent a lot of time studying terrorism and a lot of time flying combat missions overhead terrorist organizations. And one really brilliant thing in this movie that I like is that there's these two Palestinians that are like deciding to be suicide bombers. And there's some really hilarious moments where he's like, and I'm going to go and for the cause, I'm going to give my life and tell my mom, don't forget to get the bread from this store because it's 2 for 1. And they're like, wait, what? And it's like this very like, the guy is like going to give to the cause, but he still has his mom to think about it. Like, who's going to take care of my mom? So, and the sort of hardcore Israeli side said, oh, it's a pro-Palestinian movie. The Palestinians said, no, it's a pro-Israeli movie. Those are the best kind of books and things to read, because you're like, there must be something to that if both sides think that either it's exactly the opposite or exactly on their side. Okay. And so as we do the Q&A, which we'll start now, I'm just going to leave this up here. We'd love for you guys to fill out an inquiry form, find out more about Torrey Honors. So you can write down any of the contact info there, or you can just quickly sign this scan the QR code, and it'll have a little drop down that says like, what event did you attend? And you can just put the virtual CLT seminar. And it's, again, you're not committing to anything other than getting some emails from us and hearing a little bit more about Torrey Honors. And if you get tired of those emails, you are welcome to unsubscribe. So, but if you don't sign up for them, you'll never know. And again, I will be sending out emails the next time so that you can hear our other professor, Dr. Todd Thompson, talk about Homer in about a month from now. So, okay, thank you guys so much. And I'll turn it over to the panelists to talk about questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Van Hook. I can get us started on questions, and then I can circle through for the chat. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to put those in the chat for us. One thing that I love while reading Tocqueville was his beautiful lines on how America has combated some of these dangers of democracy by the means of liberty and American culture. Has some really, really powerful words that still speak to our culture today. So a question for Dr. Van Hook, especially with younger members of our audience who are starting to become more active in social and political life, especially in our new season of presidential elections that are coming up in the next couple of years. What are a couple of suggestions that Tocqueville would have specifically for younger citizens beginning to be more involved in political and social life, since it is so important for the self to be actively involved in such things?
Yeah, great. So every generation grows up with things that affect them deeply, right? For me, it was the Challenger explosion and this, like, the future of the space. You know, we're going to go to space, we're going to have all this amazing progress, and then it's kind of shattered. And you realize that technology cannot solve every problem, that there are still failures, that people are going to die to move things forward. The generation behind me that grew up in that shadow of 9/11, which is, again, I'm at the older end of that, but I was actually at squadron workout day in the gym when we're like, wait, what is going on? Like, we just did a workout. We go look at the screens and one of the towers already hit, and then we're watching and the second tower hits. Now put yourself in my shoes. There is some very sadly uninformed newspaper reporters like, wow, they must be like, their instruments must be really bad to run them into those towers. And you're just thinking like, do you really think pilots are that dumb? Like, there's not a cloud in the sky. We don't trust our instruments that much. We're not going to like drive into buildings, right? We're just thinking something really bad is happening. Sure enough, like, and then I went into immediate alert mode. We packed our bags and said, you're going to go somewhere in the world and you don't know where, but be ready because we're going to call you and you're going to have to go in 12 hours. So, I mean, that was part that it shaped my young adulthood as a husband and a father. And so for you guys, COVID is a big part of that. Now, why is that important? Because COVID is shaping a lot of the things that you are thinking about politically. COVID is not just a virus. That's a medical issue. It is a political issue. As you know, Tocqueville would have had a lot to say about these crazy things that happen in federalism. We're like, wait, how come California literally has people like locked down and can't eat Thanksgiving dinner with Aunt May? And yet South Dakota, they're out like riding horses, doing donkey basketball in an indoor court, right? And you're like, how is this working, right? Tocqueville's like, yeah, there's some interesting federalism things there. The worst thing for you guys to do would be to take COVID and try and draw like one conclusion from it. You need to come back and take lots of conclusions for that. And you have to be willing to not stick by the things you once thought. You may have to say science is now telling us something totally different, because again, every real scientist is like, we never know what's right the first time around. Sometimes we get lucky and we're close, right? But we got a lot of work to do to figure out, like, you know, things like this are really take a long time to figure out. We want to be open to figuring that out. Just like Tocqueville would say, this is still part of the developing story of America. You have to figure out what that did. Shutting churches down, Tocqueville would have been like, that was a death sentence for democracy, to shut churches down, right? To shut the civil associations down would be a death sentence for him. To have all of the newspapers conglomerated into 2 or 3 main outlets and everybody parrot each other. He's like, oh my gosh. So a lot of those barriers fell very quickly. I mean, they've been falling for a while, but fell very quickly during COVID. The Tocquevilles are like, okay, what are you going to erect instead of that? Because if you now have 3 newspapers for the country, you are not going to get the kinds of defense mechanisms I talked about, right? So yeah, I don't know if that helps at all, Sarah. And I don't know if Annalise and Annalise, if you have anything to weigh in, or Mary Grace on that, feel free.
So something I noticed that you brought up in the how to assess the baby in its cradle was every single point related from what I saw back to permanence of ownership, actually. The American citizens, what seems to make it stick in Tocqueville's writing is that they can count on the kind of land ownership that only the aristocracy would have had, on the kind of object ownership, on the kind of ownership in their towns, in their cities. They have a stake in everything, and they can count on that stake to stay. So with what Sierra was saying for young or younger people trying to get more into things at the moment, is we live in an era of permanent ownership, if that makes sense. I mean, look at the digital things. You can see we don't own movies anymore. You rent them online. You don't own anything on Amazon, really. So taking that responsibility, accountability, and ownership in it to continue what Tocqueville saw as, in my opinion, as a basic foundation for democracy's continuance.
Yeah, Annalise, you're accepted into Torrey like anytime you want now, because that was ridiculously profound. That was amazing. Yeah, and you hit on one of my favorite sections. And if I had had a whole nother hour, I'd probably talk about exactly what you talked about. I'll give you the 1-minute version. So one, yeah, that loss of ownership, the whole like I have Spotify and I own nothing, and even owning things digitally, which can be taken away very quickly. Like a record company, imagine a record company in 1970 coming in and smashing all of your like vinyl albums, right? That's pretty hard to take care of. You're not going to do that. But a record company was like, oh, by the way, we unleashed this new software that just even the things you purchase, we just erase from your, from your drive. That's pretty easy to do. So yeah, that permanence is really something that Tocqueville was noticing. We've already gone in that direction. And he's like, you got to be careful about that. So he says what happened, right? The land used to be tied to names in your family, and it was so important. So, and the closest thing you have, which you would say is sort of the degraded version of that, is something like, if you've ever seen Gone with the Wind, like Tara. And if you're a kid, you're like, you get to the end of this movie and you're like, who is Tara? Did I like miss an entire important character? Because she said the answer to everything is Tara. And they're like, yeah, that was the name of her land. And you're like, who cares about that? And Tocqueville's like, yep, that's the most American thing you could have said, little Matt Van Hook, when you're 5, right? Like, that's the most American thing you could have said. Tara is everything. She doesn't need Rhett, right? The end of that, by the way, is not, that's why the sequel is ridiculous. That book does not end with her chasing after Rhett. That book was like, screw you, Rhett, I'm taking over and I'm going to run Tara. It's the only thing I have left, right? Now, the sad joke about it is Tara's dead forever, right? She is still living in Tocqueville's world of like trying to bring this French aristocracy to the South. It's all done by now. And that's what Tocqueville says early in the first few chapters, where he says, look, that's all been broken up. The names, it's not just that we're breaking up the land, because each generation, right, in France, who gets the land when you're dead? Your oldest gets the land, right? The British will be like, we're better because the oldest, even though they're a guy or a girl, they get the land. Guy or gal, they're going to get the land. France is lame because only the guys get it. But it stays in the family and it stays complete. And then he's like, in America, they're like, hey, dad died and he had 7 kids. Like, well, now we all get 1/7 of the land. And they're like, okay, now we're going to co-op together. And then 5 of those sons and daughters are like, well, our kids don't want to farm. And then like, I'm going to sell it. Like, no, don't sell it. We need that. And next thing you know, the giant plot of land is like down to like 5 acres where you can barely keep like your favorite horse in the backyard. Right. And he says that, but he says, it's not just about breaking it up physically into these little plots. He's like, you are literally ripping the soul out of this land and taking the name and smashing it forever, so that land, he says, once great estates get broken apart, they'll never come together again. One of my few critiques of Tocqueville is he missed one thing, because I have family farms on my wife's side. They do come together again, but now by giant corporations, because now no one family is ever going to be like, I'm going to buy this family farm in Missouri. Like, great, cut us a check for $30 million. People don't have to like, so what was originally the Auger family land in my wife's family is now split up, and it hasn't happened to them yet. But if they were to split that up, no one Auger can buy the rest out and just own all the land. So they'd have to split it up and figure all that out. And what's going to happen at the end, right, is that that some conglomerate can be like, I could own the whole thing. And then you get what my granddad, before he passed away, Michelle's granddad, would call, that's that hog operation, right? It was not a farm anymore. There was no soul to it. There was no family. He didn't know who lived in that house anymore. Actually, they raised that house to the ground and put up like, another bigger silo or some kind of machinery for the farm. He's like, yep, that's an operation. That's not a farm. That's exactly what you were talking about there, Annalise. And it's powerful. So for your generation, to get to the end of your question, I would recommend you guys have to start thinking about like how to then make meaningful things that you can hold on to, right, in some way. And that doesn't mean like going back into the past, but you have to recognize those risks and say, wait a minute, there might be a technological way where once those songs are on my computer, they're protected in a way that they could never be taken away for again. You're going to need new ways of protecting them. That's really the answer. If you don't think you can turn the ship around, intellectual property, it's all stolen, right? AI has already sucked all of our intellectual property and is writing its own stories based off of what you told it. And there's nothing we can do to get it back, because lo and behold, we threw all that stuff in journals that are all of us scholars have thrown all that to the journals. And AI's like, hey, I just thought of this myself. And you're like, no, you didn't, Leibowitz. That was not your idea. So, okay. Any other questions? I know I can stay for a few more minutes, but I know it is time. I want to be respectful for that. So.
I want to give Mary Grace or Annalise one more chance to just ask any questions you have, be it a question from within the text or sort of over and above the text or anything in between. But as I give you a moment to think or signal that it's 7 o'clock and we should call it, I do want to thank Dr. Van Hook and Sierra for joining us. This has been so great. And I do want to also plug our next seminars. So we're going to continue the theme of American democracy. October 5th, we're going to discuss Ida B. Wells. I think that's a great way to continue this conversation, because for Tocqueville, he's very concerned about, what is the character of democratic people going to be like? And I think Ida B. Wells is a chance for us to look at a democratic hero, like the potential for an actual sort of glorious vision of democracy. And then we're coming back to Torrey after that. So later in October, we'll be discussing Homer. And then after that, we'll be discussing Plato with the founder of Torrey Honors College, who is now the president of St. Constantine College. We have a good yes or no question for you to end with, actually, in the Q&A,
Okay.
Dr. Van Hook. And that is whether Hamilton the musical is historically accurate. You're the expert.
Oh, in the same way, I love Baz Luhrmann movies, and in the same way that his Romeo and Juliet, Gatsby, Moulin Rouge, they're doing something pretty powerful with what they're doing. It's not meant to, it's again, it's a different way of crafting it, but I do think that Lin-Manuel Miranda does the most amazing job of taking this huge story, packing it down. And it is because now I'm also biased because you can see him, and one of my mentors, Dr. Steve Knott, who, when he's giving lectures on Hamilton. So again, I not only was I doing Hamilton in the 2010s, I was doing Hamilton since 1995 at the Air Force Academy when nobody liked them still, right? And you can see at one of Dr. Knott's lectures, Lin-Manuel Miranda is like scribbling notes, like deeply down. And that was when I was like, this is why it's good, because he's really trying to not just go to what he could hear. The Chernow book is the best biography written on him. That's a great place to start. But he actually went to other scholarly lectures and was just really did his homework to get the story right. There's a few things with the relationships with the women that I have like a few like small minor things with, but yeah, I actually think it's one of the most important musicals you could watch. 1776, on the other hand, is one of the most depressing, ridiculous musicals ever. Toss it out, replace it with Hamilton. That's my 2 cents on that. So, and one other thing, high school students looking for a great project with Tocqueville, do something small. When Tocqueville talks about poetry, like, look, if there's no good poetry in America, and we're like, oh, that's kind of sad. And if there ever was, what they would think is good would be this kind. Like, go do a project on Tocqueville and Emily Dickinson, and you'll blow your teachers away, and it'll be a lot of fun because you can pick just a few poems, a really short piece of Tocqueville. You could do those kind of projects for whether you're homeschooled or charter school or private or public. You could do those for literature classes and really get a lot out of those, because again, Tocqueville is also literature. So.
That's fantastic. Well, I don't want to keep you all any longer. Thank you so much to each one of you for coming. And I hope to see you again.
Toby, we're going to tell Miley you were here. Okay, I will see her in class next week, so I will tell her hi for you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.